China. The modern history of China has revolved around the question of how to regain sovereignty, end the humiliation of foreign occupation, and bring about equality and development. Chinese debates were marked by the views of three groups. The early reformers, such as Kang Youwei, 1858 to 1927, or Liang Qichao, 1873 to 1929, tried to use traditional ideas in new and different ways to meet the challenges posed by the West. Second, Republican revolutionaries such as Sun Yat sen, the first president of the Republic, were inspired by ideas from Japan and the West. The third, the Communist Party of China, CCP, wanted to end age old inequalities and drive out the foreigners. The beginning of modern China can be traced to its first encounter with the West in the 16th and 17th centuries when Jesuit missionaries introduced Western sciences such as astronomy and mathematics. Limited to its immediate impact was it set in motion events that gathered momentum in the 19th century when Britain used force to expand its lucrative trade in opium, leading to the First Opium War, 1839 to 42. This undermined the ruling Qing dynasty and strengthened demands for reform and change. The opium trade. The demand for Chinese goods such as tea, silk, and porcelain created a serious balance of trade problem. Western goods did not find a market in China, so payment had to be in silver. The East India Company found a new option, opium, which grew in India. They sold the opium in China and gave the silver that they earned to company agents in Canton in return for letters of credit. The company used the silver to buy tea, silk, and porcelain to sell in Britain. This was the triangular trade between Britain, India, and China. Qing dynasty reformers such as Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao realized the need to strengthen the system and initiated policies to build a modern administrative system, a new army, and an educational system that set local assemblies to establish constitutional government. They saw the need to protect China from colonization. The negative example of colonized countries worked powerfully on Chinese thinkers. The partition of Poland in the 18th century was a much discussed example, so much so that by the late 1890s it came to be used as a verb, to Polen us, Bolen wo. India was another such example. In 1903, the thinker Liang Qichao, who believed that only by making people aware that China was a nation would they be able to resist the West, wrote that India was a country that was destroyed by a non country, that is, the East India Company. He criticized Indians for being cruel to their own people and subservient to the British. Such arguments carried a powerful appeal as ordinary Chinese could see that the British used Indian soldiers in their wars on China. Above all, many felt that traditional ways of thinking had to be changed. Confucianism Confucianism developed from the teachings of Confucius 551 to 479 BCE, and his disciples was concerned with good conduct, practical wisdom, and proper social relationships. It influenced the Chinese attitude towards life, provided social standards, and laid the basis for political theories and institutions. It was now seen as a major barrier to new ideas and institutions. To train people in modern subjects, students were sent to study in Japan, Britain, and France and bring back new ideas. Many Chinese students went to Japan in the 1890s. They not only brought back new ideas, but many became leading Republicans. The Chinese borrowed even Japanese translations of European words such as justice, rights, and revolution because they used the same ideographic script, a reversal of the traditional relationship. In 1905, just after the Russo Japanese War, a war fought on Chinese soil and over Chinese territory, the centuries old Chinese examination system that gave candidates entry into the elite ruling class was abolished. The examination system. Entry to the elite ruling class, about 1.1 million till 1850, have been largely through an examination. This required writing an 8 long legged essay, Pakuwent, in classical Chinese in a prescribed form. The examination was held twice every 3 years at different levels, and of those allowed to sit, only 1 to 2% passed the first level, usually by the age of 24, to become what was we call beautiful talent. At any given time before 1850, there were about 526,869 civil and 212,330 military provincial Shengyuan degree holders in the whole country. Since there were only 27,000 official positions, many lower level degree holders did not have jobs. The examination acted as a barrier to the development of science and technology as it demanded only literary skills. In 1905, it was abolished as it was based on skills in classical Chinese learning that had, it was felt, no relevance to the modern world. Establishing the Republic. The Manchu Empire was overthrown and a republic established in 1911 under Sun Yat sen, 1866 to 1925, who is unanimously regarded as the founder of modern China. He came from a poor family and studied in missionary schools where he was introduced to democracy and Christianity. He studied medicine but was greatly concerned about the fate of China. His program was called the Three Principles, San Min Chui. These were nationalism. This meant overthrowing the Manchu, who were seen as a foreign dynasty, as well as other foreign imperialists, democracy or establishing democratic government, and socialism, regulating capital and equalizing land holdings. The social and political situation continued to be unstable. On 4th May 1919, an angry demonstration was held in Beijing to protest against the decision of the post war peace conference. Despite being an ally to the victorious side led by the Britain, China did not get back the territory seized from it. The protest became a movement. It galvanized a whole generation to attack tradition and to call for saving China through modern science, democracy, and nationalism. Revolutionaries called for driving out the foreigners who were controlling the country's resources to remove inequalities and reduce poverty. They advocated reforms such as the use of simple language in writing, abolishing the practice of foot binding and the subordination of women, equality in marriage, and economic development to end poverty. After the Republican Revolution, when country entered a period of turmoil, the Kuomintang, the National People's Party, and the CCP emerged as a major force striving to unite the country and bring stability. Sun Yat sen's ideas became the basis for the political philosophy of the Kuomintang. They identified the four great needs as clothing, food, housing, and transportation. After the death of Sun, Chiang Kai shek emerged as the leader of the Kuomintang as he launched a military campaign to control the warlords, regional leaders who had usurped authority, and to eliminate the communists. He advocated a secular and rational this worldly Confucianism, but also sought to militarize the nation. The people, he said, must develop a and instinct for unified behavior. He encouraged women to cultivate the four virtues of chastity, appearance, speech, and work, and recognized their role as confined to the household. Even the length of hemlines was prescribed. The Kuomintang's social base was in urban areas. Industrial growth was slow and limited. In cities such as Shanghai, which became the centers for modern growth, by 1919 an industrial working class had appeared, numbering 500,000. Of these, however, only a small percentage were employed in modern industries such as shipbuilding. Most were petty urbanites, traders, and shopkeepers. Urban workers, particularly women, earned very low wages, Working hours were long and conditions of work bad. As individualism increased, there was a growing concern with women's rights, ways to build the family, and discussions about love and romance. Social and cultural change was helped along by the spread of schools and universities. Peking University was established in 1902. Journalism flourished, reflecting the growing attraction of this new thinking. The popularly Life Weekly, edited by Zhao Taofind, 1895 to 1944, is representative of this new trend. It introduced readers to new ideas as well as to leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi and Kemal Ataturk, the modernist leader of Turkey. Its circulation increased rapidly from just 2,000 in 1926 to a massive 200,000 copies in 1933. Shanghai in 1935. Buck Clayton, a black American trumpet player in Shanghai with his jazz orchestra, lived the life of a privileged expatriate. But he was black, and once some white Americans assaulted him and his orchestra members and threw him out from the hotel they played in. Thus, though American, he had greater sympathy for the plight of the Chinese, being himself a victim of racial discrimination. Of their fight with white Americans, where they emerged victorious, he writes, "The Chinese onlookers treated us like we had done something they always wanted to do, and followed us all the way home, cheering us like a winning football team." On the poverty and hard life of the Chinese, Clayton writes, "I would see sometimes 20 or 30 coolies pulling a big heavy cart that in America would be pulled by a truck or horses. These people seemed to be nothing but human horses, and all they would get at the end of the day was just enough to get a couple of bowls of rice and a place to sleep. I don't know how they did it." The Kuomintang, despite its attempts to unite the country, failed because of its narrow social base and limited political vision. A major plank in Sun Yat-sen's program regulating capital and equalizing land was never carried out because the party ignored the peasantry and the rising social inequalities. It sought to impose military order rather than address the problems faced by the people. The rise of the Communist Party of China. When the Japanese invaded China in 1937, the Kuomintang retreated. The long and exhausting war weakened China. Prices rose 30% per month between 1945 and 1949 and utterly destroyed the lives of ordinary people. Rural China faced two crises, one ecological and with soil exhaustion, deforestation, and floods, and the second a socio-economic one caused by exploitative land tenure systems, indebtedness, primitive technology, and poor communications. The CCP has been founded in 1921, soon after the Russian Revolution. The Russian success exercised a powerful influence around the world, and leaders such as Lenin and Trotsky went on to establish the Comintern on the Third International in March 1918 to help bring about a government that would end exploitation. The Comintern and the Soviet Union supported communist parties around the world, but they worked within the traditional Marxist understanding that the revolution would be brought about by the working class in cities. Its initial appeal across national boundaries was immense, but it soon became a tool for Soviet interests and was dissolved in 1943. Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976, who emerged as a major CCP leader, took a different path by basing his revolutionary program on the peasantry. His success made the CCP a powerful political force that ultimately won against the Kuomintang. Mao Zedong's radical approach can be seen in Jiangxi, in mountains where they camped from 1928 to 1934, secure from Kuomintang attacks. A strong peasant council was organized, united through confiscation and redistribution of land. Mao, unlike other leaders, stressed the need for an independent government and army. He had become aware of women's problems and supported the emergence of rural women's associations, promulgated a new marriage law that forbade arranged marriages, stopped purchase or sale of marriage contracts, and simplified divorce. In a survey in 1930 in Zunwu, Mao Zedong looked at everyday commodities such as salt and soybeans, at the relative strengths of local organizations, at petty traders and craftsmen, ironsmiths, and prostitutes, and the strength of religious organizations to examine the different levels of exploitation. He gathered statistics of the number of peasants who had sold their children and found out what price they received. Boys were sold for 100 to 200 yuan, but there were no instances for the sale of girls because the need was for hard labor, not sexual exploitation. It was on the basis of these studies that he advocated ways of solving social problems. The Kuomintang blockade of the Communist Soviet forced the party to seek another base. This led them to go on what came to be called the Long March, 1934 to 35, 6,000 grueling and difficult miles to Shanxi. Here in their new base in Yan'an, they further developed the program to end warlordism, carry out land reforms, and fight foreign imperialism. This won them a strong social base. In the difficult years of the war, the Communists and Kuomintang worked together, but after the end of the war, the Communists established themselves in power and Kuomintang was defeated. Establishing the new democracy 1949 to 65. The People's Republic of China government was established in 1949. It was based on the principles of the new democracy, an alliance of all social classes, and like the dictatorship of the proletariat that the Soviet Union said it had established. Critical areas of the economy were put under government control, and private enterprise and private ownership of land was gradually ended. This program lasted till 1953 when the government declared that it would launch a program of socialist transformation. The Great Leap Forward movement, launched in 1958, was a policy to galvanize the country to industrialize rapidly. People were encouraged to set up steel furnaces in their backyards. In the rural areas, people's communes where land could be collectively owned and cultivated were started. By 1958, there were 26,000 communes covering 98% of the farm population. Mao was able to mobilize the masses to attain the goal set by the party. His concern was with the creating of socialist man who would have five loves: fatherland, people, labor, science, and public property. Mass organizations were created for farmers, women, students, and other groups. For instance, the All China Democratic Women's Federation has 76 million members. The All China Students Federation 3.29 million members. These objectives and methods did not appeal to everyone in the party. In 1953 to 54, some were urging for more attention to industrial organization and economic growth. Liu Shaoqi 1896 to 1969 and Deng Xiaoping 1904 to 97 tried to modify the commune system as it was not working efficiently. The steel produced in the backyard furnaces was unusable industrially. Conflicting visions 1965 to 1978. The conflict between the Maoists wanted to create a socialist man and those who objected to this emphasis on ideology rather than expertise culminated in Mao launching the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution in 1965 to counter his critics. The Red Guards, mainly students and the army, was used for a campaign against old culture, old customs, and old habits. Students and professionals were sent to the countryside to learn from the masses. Ideology, being communist, was more important than having professional knowledge. Denunciations and slogans replaced rational debate. The Cultural Revolution began a period of turmoil, weakened the party, and severely disrupted the economy and educational system. From the late 1960s, the tide began to turn. In 1975, the party once again laid emphasis on greater social discipline and the need to build an industrial economy so that China would become a power before the end of the century. Reforms from 1978. The Cultural Revolution was followed by a process of political maneuvering. Deng Xiaoping kept party control strong while introducing a socialist market economy. In 1978, the party declared its goal as the four modernization to develop science, industry, agriculture, defense. Debate was allowed as long as the party was not questioned. In this new and liberating climate, as at the time of the May 4th movement 60 years earlier, there was an exciting explosion of new ideas. On 5th December 1978, a wall poster, the fifth modernization, proclaimed that without democracy, the other modernization would come to nothing. It went on to criticize the CCP for not solving the problem of poverty or ending sexual exploitation, even citing cases of such abuse from within the party. These demands were suppressed, but in 1989, on the 17th anniversary of the May 4th movement, many intellectuals called for greater openness and an end to ossified dogmas. Student demonstrators at Tiananmen Square in Beijing were brutally repressed. This was strongly condemned around the world. The post reform period has seen the emergence of debates on ways to develop China. The dominant view supported by the party is based on strong political control, economic liberalization, and integration into the world market. Critics argue that increasing inequalities between social groups, between regions, and between men and women are creating social tensions and questions the heavy emphasis on the market. Finally, there is a growing revival of earlier so called traditional ideas of Confucianism and arguments that China can build a modern society following its own tradition rather than simply copying the West. The story of Taiwan. Chiang Kai shek, defeated by the CCP, fled in 1949 to Taiwan with over 300 million US dollars in gold reserves and crates of priceless art treasures and established the Republic of China. Taiwan had been a Japanese colony since the Chinese ceded it after 1894-95 war with Japan. The Cairo Declaration 1943 and the Potsdam Proclamation 1949 restored sovereignty to China. Massive demonstrations in February 1947 had led the GMD to brutally kill a whole generation of leading figures. The GMD under Chiang Kai shek went on to establish a repressive government forbidding free speech and political opposition and excluding the local population from positions of power. However, they carried out land reforms that increased agricultural productivity and modernized the economy so that by 1973 Taiwan had a GNP second only to that of Japan in Asia. The economy, largely dependent on the trade, had been steadily growing, but that is important. What is important is that the gap between the rich and the poor has been steadily declining. Even more dramatic has been the transformation of Taiwan into a democracy. It became slowly after the death of Chiang in 1975 and grew in momentum when martial law was lifted in 1987 and opposition parties were legally permitted. The first free elections began the process of bringing local Taiwanese to power. Diplomatically, most countries have only trade missions in Taiwan. Full diplomatic relations and embassies are not possible as Taiwan is considered to be part of China. The question of reunification with the mainland remains a contentious issue, but cross strait relations, that is, between Taiwan and China, have been improving, and Taiwanese trade and investments in the mainland are massive, and travel have also become easier. China may be willing to tolerate a semi autonomous Taiwan as long as it gives up any move to seek independence. The story of Korea, beginning of modernization. During the late 19th century, Korea's Joseon dynasty, 1392 to 1910, faced internal political and social strife and increasing foreign pressure from China, Japan, and the West. Amidst this, Korea implemented modernization reforms in its governmental structures, diplomatic relations, infrastructure, and society. After decades of political interference, the Imperial Japan annexed Korea as its colony in 1910, bringing the bringing the over 500-year-long Joseon dynasty to its end. However, the Korean people were angry about Japan's suppression of their culture and forced assimilation. Desiring independence, Koreans around the country demonstrated against the colonial rule, set up a provisional government, and sent delegations to appeal to foreign leaders at international meetings, such as the Cairo, Yalta, and Potsdam conferences. The Japanese colonial rule ended after 35 years in August 1945 with Japan's defeat in World War II. However, it was continued efforts of independence activists both inside and outside Korea that ensured Korea's independence after Japan's defeat. Following liberation, the Korean peninsula was temporarily divided along the 38 parallel, with the Soviets managing the north and the UN managing the south, even as the nations worked to disband the Japanese forces in the region. However, this division became permanent as separate governments were established in both the north and the south in 1948. A post war nation, in June 1950, the Korean War broke out, with South Korea receiving support from the US led United Nations forces and North Korea receiving support from Communist China. It developed into a vintage proxy war of the Cold War era. In July 1953, after 3 years, the war ended in an armistice agreement. Korea remained divided. The Korean War had caused not only massive losses of life and property, but also a delay in free market economic development and democratization. Prices suddenly rose to, due to inflation caused by increased national expenses and currency issued during the war. Furthermore, industrial facilities constructed during the colonial period had been destroyed entirely. As a result, South Korea was forced to rely on the economic assistance being provided by the USA. Though South Korea's first president, Syngman Rhee, had been elected in 1948 through democratic process after the Korean War, he extended his administration twice through illegal constitutional amendments. In April 1960, citizens protested against a rigged election in what is known as the April Revolution, and Rhee was forced to resign. With the revolution as an impetus, the spirit of the people, which had been suppressed during the Rhee administration, erupted in the form of demonstrations and demands. However, the Democratic Party administration, which took over power after the Rhee's resignation, could not properly respond to citizens' demands due to internal divisions and conflict. Rather, reformist political powers emerged and the students' movement grew into unification movement. This was not looked upon favorably by the government, by the military authorities. In May 1961, the Democratic Party government was overthrown in a military coup staged by General Park Chung-hee and other military authorities. Rapid industrialization under strong leadership. In October 1963, an election was held and military coup leader Park Chung-hee was elected the president. The Park administration adopted a state-led export-oriented policy to achieve economic growth. The five-year economic plans of the government favored large corporate firms, placed emphasis on expanding employment and increased Korea's competitiveness. Korea's unprecedented rate of economic growth began in the early 1960s when the state policy shifted from import substitution industrialization ISI towards a focus on exports. Under the export oriented policy, the government supported labor intensive light industrial products such as textiles and garments, in which Korea had a comparative advantage. During the late 1960s and 1970s, the focus again shifted from light industries to value added heavy and chemical industries. Steel, non ferrous metals, machinery, shipbuilding, electronics, and chemical production were selected as the most important industries in the race for economic growth. In 1970, the New Village Sai Mall movement was introduced to encourage and mobilize the rural population and modernize the agricultural sector. This campaign aimed at reforming the spirit of this people from being passive and disheartened to becoming active and hopeful. Rural people were empowered to help themselves in developing rural people were empowered to become rural people were empowered to help themselves in developing their villages and improve the living conditions of their respective communities. The movement was later expanded to assist the neighborhoods near industrial plants and in urban areas. Today, Korea is sharing the knowledge and experiences from this movement with developing countries who wish to adopt the principles of Semol movement in their development efforts. Korea achieved startling economic growth thanks to a combination of strong leaders, well trained bureaucrats, aggressive industrialists, and a capable labor force. Ambitious entrepreneurs responded well to government incentives to increase exports and develop new industries. The high level of education also contributed to the economic growth of Korea. At the dawn of Korea's industrialization, almost all Korean workers were already literate and could easily acquire new skills. At the same time, the country's open economic policy worked to absorb more advanced institutions and technologies from other countries. Foreign investment and Korea's high domestic savings rate helped develop the heavy industrial sector, while remittances from South Korean workers overseas also contributed to the overall economic development. Economic growth was the foundation of the Park administration's long term power. Park revised the constitution so that he could run for a third term and was re elected in 1971. In October 1972, Park declared and implemented the Yusin constitution, which made permanent presidency possible. Under the Yusin constitution, the president had complete authority over legislation, jurisdiction, and administration, and also had a constitutional right to repeal any law as emergency measure. As the president was invested with an absolute authority, the progress of democracy was temporarily suspended in pursuit of economic development. However, the second oil crisis in 1979 acted as a hindrance to the economic policy which had overinvested in the heavy chemical industry. Moreover, students, scholars, and the opposition continually demonstrated against the Yusin constitution as the Park administration's invocation of emergency measures and suppression brought about political instability. Amidst this economic crisis and political instability, the Park administration came to an end in October 1979 when Park Chung-hee was assassinated. Continued economic growth and calls for democratization. The desire for democratization grew upon the death of Park Chung-hee. But in December 1979, another military coup, this time led by Chun Do-hwan, was staged. In May 1980, various protests in key cities around the nation were held by students and citizens demanding democracy in the face of Chun's military faction. The military faction suppressed the democracy movement by implementing martial law across the country. In the city of Gwangju, in particular, students and citizens did not back down and demanded that martial law be ended. This is known as the Guangzhou Democratization Movement. However, Jun's military faction suppressed the protests for democratization. Later that year, Jun became the president through an indirect election under Yusin constitution. The Jun administration strengthened the suppression and democratization influences in order to stabilize the regime. Due to its part in the international economic boom, the Chun administration was able to raise economic growth from 1.7% in 1980 to 13.2% by 1983, while also significantly lowering inflation. Economic development has led to urbanization, improved education levels, and media advancements. As a result, citizens' self awareness about political rights grew, leading to demands for a constitutional amendment to allow direct election of the president. In May 1987, the Chun administration's minimization of inquiries into the death by torture of a university student was made known, making citizens begin participate in a large scale struggle for democratization. The June democracy movement that followed had participation not only by students but the middle class as well. Owing to these efforts, the June administration was forced to make a revision to the constitution, allowing direct elections. A new chapter of Korean democracy thus began. Korean democracy and the IMF crisis. As per the new constitution, the first direct election since 1971 was held in December 1987, but due to the opposition party's failure to unite, a fellow military leader of Jun's military faction, Roh Tae-woo, was elected. However, Korea continued along the path of democracy. In 1990, long-term opposition leader Kim Yong-sam compromised with Roh's party to create a large ruling party. In December 1992, Kim, a civilian, was elected the president after decades of military rule. With his election and the subsequent dissolution of authoritarian military power, democracy made its forward march. Under the export driven policy of the new administration, several companies grew to global prominence, which continued until the early 1990s. With governmental support, Korean conglomerates invested in capital intensive heavy and chemical industries as well as electronic industries, while the government continued to focus on building industrial and economic infrastructure. Meanwhile, under increasing neoliberalist pressure to open its market, the Kim administration joined the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD) in 1996 and attempted to strengthen Korea's international competitiveness. But amidst increasing trade deficits, poor management by the financial institutions, reckless business operations by conglomerates, and more, Korea was met with a foreign currency crisis in 1997. The crisis was dealt with through emergency financial support provided by the International Monetary Fund (IMF). Simultaneous efforts were also made to improve the country's economic constitution as the citizens actively contributed towards foreign loan repayment through the gold collection movement. In December 1997, longtime opposition party leader Kim Dae-jung was elected the president for the first time in Korea, marking a peaceful transfer of power. The second peaceful transfer of power came in 2008 when conservative Lee Myung-bak was elected as the president. Following the progressive Roh Moo-yoon administration in 2012, conservative Park Geun-hye was elected as the first female president. At the beginning of her presidency, she gained support due to the political legacy of her father, Park Chung-hee. But in October 2016, as it came to light that she had let a friend secretly manage government affairs, she met with nationwide protests, leading to her impeachment and removal from office in March 2017. In May 2017, Moon Jae-in was elected the president in a peaceful transfer of power for the third time. The candlelight protests of 2016, led by citizens who peacefully demonstrated for the president's resignation within the boundaries of democratic law and systems, shows that maturity of the Korean democracy. The Korean democracy owes a debt to economic development, but it was the citizens' elevated political awareness to encourage republicanism in the country which played the lead role in advancing it to where it is today. Two roads to modernization. Industrial societies, far from becoming like each other, have found their own paths to becoming modern. The histories of Japan and China, along with the stories of Taiwan and Korea, show how different historical conditions led them on widely divergent paths to building independent and modern nations. Japan was successful in retaining its independence and using traditional skills and practices in new ways. However, its elite driven modernization generated an aggressive nationalism helped to sustain a repressive regime that stifled dissent and demands of democracy and established a colonial empire that left a legacy of hatred in the region as well as distorted internal developments. Japan's program of modernization was carried out in an environment dominated by Western imperial powers. While it imitated them, it also attempted to find its own solutions. Japanese nationalism was marked by these three different compulsions, while many Japanese hoped to liberate Asia from Western domination. For others, these ideas justified building an empire. It is important to note that the transformation of social and political institutions and daily life was not just a question of reviving traditions or tenaciously preserving them, but rather of creatively using them in new and different ways. For instance, the Meiji school system, modeled on European and American practices, introduced new subjects, but the curriculum main objective was to make loyal citizens. A course on moral and stress loyalty to the emperor was compulsory. Similarly, changes in the family or in daily life show how foreign and indigenous ideas were brought together to create something new. The Chinese path to modernization was very different. Foreign imperialism, both Western and Japanese, combined with a hesitant and unsure king dynasty to weaken government control and set the stage for breakdown of political and social order, leading to immense misery for most of the people. Warlordism, banditry, and civil war exacted a heavy toll on human lives, as did the savagery of the Japanese invasion. Natural disasters added to this burden. The 19th and 20th century saw a rejection of traditions and for for search for ways to build national unity and strength. The CCP and its supporters fought to put an end to tradition which they saw as keeping the masses in poverty, the women subjugated, and the country underdeveloped. While calling for people to the people, at, it built a highly centralized state. The success of the communist program promised hope, but its repressive political system turned the ideals of liberation and equality into slogans to manipulate the people. Yet it did remove centuries old inequalities, spread education, and raise consciousness among the people. The party has now carried out market reforms and has been successful in making China economically powerful, but its political system continues to be tightly controlled. The society now faces growing inequalities as well as a revival of traditions long suppressed. This new situation again poses the question of how China can develop while retaining its heritage.